Ryan Doyle in for Michael Corrin this evening. You know, whether it's a hurricane, a flood, a drought, it always seems that it comes back to extreme weather being blamed on one thing: climate change. Even in my own household, I know that the second we see a story that it has to do with flooding, well, that always gets blamed on climate change, and then the debate rages, even in my own kitchen. Bjorn Lomborg is a professor, director of the Copenhagen Consensus Center. He's got a new book out that we're going to talk about thoroughly in the next few minutes. But Bjorn, let's talk a little bit about the idea of extreme weather being blamed and pinned on climate change. That's not necessarily the case, is it?
No, listen, it's really one of those memes that everybody talks about, but really has very little backing in the scientific literature. Now, there are some things that are going to get worse with global warming, and some things are going to get better. But we need to recognize there's not just a one-to-one correlation with more global warming, more extreme weather. Take, for instance, heat and cold waves. Sure, as temperatures rise, we're going to see more heat waves, and hence, we're going to see more people dying from heat. That's absolutely true. But you can't say that unless you also say, but there's going to be fewer cold waves and hence fewer people dying from cold. And since almost everywhere on the planet, many, many more people die from cold than from heat, that actually turns out to be a net benefit. We actually expect that by mid-century, about 1.4 million fewer people will die from heat and cold waves because of global warming. That's one of the stories you don't normally hear.
Yeah, it's interesting to me because when you write it down and I read it on paper, it seems to make common sense to me. But explaining that yin and yang approach, I'm guessing, can be quite a challenge.
Oh, it totally can. And listen, for instance, when people talk about flooding, yes, we are going to see more heavy precipitation. That's absolutely true. But there are two things you need to remember. First, more precipitation, which we're expecting to see from global warming, also means that we will have fewer people with water scarcity. We are expecting about 3 billion people being water scarce by the end of the century, mostly because there are many, many more people by the end of the century. But because of global warming, there'll actually be 1.2 billion fewer people water scarce. You need to tell both sides of the story. But of course, in Canada and elsewhere, you still worry about flooding. But remember, flooding is mostly a consequence of people damming in rivers. Essentially what we've done is we've built on all the floodplains, we've put up dams, and we're essentially playing a game of who doesn't have the lowest dike, which of course is a very, very poor way of trying to handle future problems with flooding. We need to let some places have the ability to flood on floodplains like they did in times of old.
When we talk about somebody at the local coffee shop blaming things on climate change, that's one thing. When the President of the United States comes out and seemingly wants to blame every extreme weather pattern or extreme weather event on climate change, that's dangerous, no?
Well, it leads to bad policy, fundamentally saying there are these terrible catastrophes that are happening and they're all caused by global warming. Essentially makes you say we're going to try to handle these problems through cutting carbon emissions. Take, for instance, Hurricane Sandy, which a lot of people blame on global warming. Fundamentally, what the science is telling us is we don't quite know, but we're probably likely to see slightly stronger, but slightly fewer hurricanes. Overall, we're actually expecting that hurricanes are going to damage less by the end of the century, mostly because we'll be more resilient. But the real issue here is to remember most of the hurricanes are going to happen no matter what. If you actually want to help future victims of Hurricane Sandy and Hurricane Katrina and all the others, you need to focus on making communities resilient. You actually end up focusing on the wrong policies, and then of course you end up subsidizing, for instance, wind and solar at huge amounts, cutting virtually no CO2 and achieving nothing on climate, but also achieving nothing on making people more resilient. That's sort of the worst of all outcomes. That's why we need to have this honest debate on global warming.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the debate that will probably be ramped up in the next couple of months. The UN releasing their summary. They've obviously studied this. This is the fifth report coming out in the last 20 some odd years. But I fear that a lot of people will hear the headlines and go into a full panic like we did some years ago when the last report came out.
And that's actually a funny thing, Ryan, because if you read the report, there's been lots of leaks, and we have a pretty good sense of what it's going to be telling us. It's not a scary report. It tells us global warming is a problem. It actually ramps down some of the really scary scenarios, and it mostly tells us this is something we need to focus on. This is an issue we need to tackle. But it does not tell us those scary stories. It tells us sea levels are going to rise somewhere between 40 and 62 centimeters. I bet most of the numbers most people hear is a meter, 2 meters, or Al Gore's 7 meters to sea level rise. That's just not in the cards. This is a problem, but it's by no means the end of humanity. And so we need to start having a conversation about how do we tackle it smartly, and also how do we not go so panicked that we end up spending all the money on policies that almost don't work.
What about the blame game? I know that they are going to come out. I mean, as you said, a lot of this has been leaked, and blame about 95% of this on being man-made. Is there any truth to that?
Well, I think what they're actually saying is that they're 95% certain that more than half of the warming we've seen since 1950 is caused by mankind. That's probably actually true, but what you fail to hear is that that's not very much. Remember, we haven't seen all that much. We've seen a little more than 1 degree over the last half century, and so at least half of that is due to mankind, which is probably pretty true. Most people seem to say, that's all of it. But remember, over the last 15, 20 years, we've seen very little or no warming, which is probably because we're in the cold phase of both the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. And so what we're essentially seeing is in the 80s and 90s, we over-worried, and now we're probably almost under-worrying about global warming. But the fundamental truth is, global warming is a problem. It's going to cost a couple of degrees, maybe even 3 degrees of warming by the end of the century. But it's not this catastrophe that you're led to believe.
I'm glad you mentioned the past years, because people, I think, fail to look at the past and look at history. I know your new book does a lot of that. Let's come back and talk a little bit about it. We'll also talk about renewable energy versus fossil fuels and that kind of thing. Bjorn Lomborg is my guest. We continue this conversation. I think it's fascinating when you look at what you've done in your book. You've talked to economists about the last 150 years of things that really have plagued or blighted the world. Why economists? Why talk to them?
Well, fundamentally, this is about getting a sense both of how big are the problems, but also how big are they compared to each other. We have this sense in which we often just talk about what looks the scariest on TV, but in reality, we need to get a sense of what actually matters. And often, that's the kind of catastrophes that happen away from the television screen, things that are not sexy, things that don't have these great campaign groups, but just happen to be incredibly, incredibly important. So what I did was I asked some of the world's top economists to look at their field on each individual area, from health and from air pollution and global warming and biodiversity and gender and all the other places, and say, how much have these problems cost the world in 1900, in 1901, 1902, all the way up to now until 2050. So we basically get a sense of, is the world moving in the right direction or the wrong direction?
What would you say the most fascinating thing to come out of this research and these conversations was in that last 150-year period?
Well, I'll give you 2 examples because I really don't want to, I'm not very good at picking. I think they're all incredibly interesting. We looked at 10, but one perhaps kind of obvious when you think about it is health. We lived in 1900, the average lifespan of a human being was 32 years. 32 years. Today, that number is 69 years. In 2050, we expect to live 76 years on average on this planet. That's a huge benefit. And if you just look at one of the things, I think we've totally forgotten how incredible it is. In 1970, we almost didn't inoculate kids. We didn't actually immunize them very much. Today, we've immunized so many kids that every year about 3 million kids survive more than would otherwise have survived. That's more than died through the 20th century wars. That's just simply one of the uncelebrated stories, and this is the Gates Foundation and many others who've helped make this happen. But this is the reality. We've seen a dramatic improvement in our health, and we need to remember that. The other one you asked for, I think, is that perhaps more surprising. When you look at pollution, most people think about global warming because it has so much airtime, but the real environmental problem in this world is actually air pollution. Air pollution kills about 5 million people each year. And then again, you think, oh, it's outdoor air pollution. It sees Bangkok and all these polluted third world cities. But in reality, most of the air pollution is indoor air pollution. It's poor people, about 3.2 billion people who cook and keep warm with bad fuels. It's twigs and cow dung and all the other stuff. And that has come down dramatically. Over the 20th century, about 200 and 60 million people died from indoor air pollution. That's twice the number of people that died in all the wars of the 20th century. So again, it's about getting a grip and actually realizing this world is a much better place now than it was in 1900, and we're actually moving in the right direction also for 2050.
Let's talk a little bit about how we do heat our homes and other such power sources. Renewable energies, a lot of people have said, you know, these are the best for us, these are the things that we need to be relying on, but you've made the argument over time that fossil fuels, they have an upside too.
Well, what most people think is renewables is this fantastic new thing that we really need to get on right now. But remember, humanity has spent the last couple of centuries getting away from renewables. These renewables are the ones that are actually killing people, especially in third world countries. If you look at the rate that we used renewables, in 1800, we estimate the world got about 94% of all its energy from renewables. And since 1960, that number has been down to about 13%, and it hasn't budged. Despite all the good green efforts, we haven't changed the percentage of what the world gets from renewable energy. And by far, the major part of this is simply poor people burning wood in their homes and, of course, contributing to deforestation. What we need to remember is renewables are not going to be a solution to global warming anytime soon for two reasons. Partly because it's incredibly expensive still, but also because it's intermittent. You don't know what to do when you don't have the sun shining or when the wind is not blowing. We don't have the technology to back this up yet at any reasonable cost. And that's why we're still not, even with very, very optimistic scenarios, going to see more than perhaps 17% of the world's energy come from renewables in 2035. So we really need to get real about this. We're not going to solve global warming with renewables anytime soon.
Yet politician after politician seemingly wants to go that route and drag taxpayers along with them.
Absolutely, and we're spending huge amounts of money. In Europe, for instance, we've decided we want to cut carbon emissions 20% below 1990 levels by 2020. That would probably cost about 0.7% of GDP had we just done it in the smartest way, which would be to shift from coal to gas. Now, that's still a huge truckload of money. It's about $125 billion per year to achieve that. But we also decided, no, we don't want to do it the cheapest possible way. We want to do it with renewables. We want to put up solar panels and wind turbines to feel good about ourselves. Of course, nature doesn't care, so we're actually spending twice as much.
I don't want to give all away that's in the book because it's fantastic stuff, but we appreciate you taking the time to share a sample of it today.
Great to meet you. See you.